Does your belly tighten up like a fist pressing low every single afternoon at almost the exact same hour, no matter what you ate that day? For years, I assumed there was no explaining it. A large share of men past 50 will deal with an enlarged prostate at some point. That's not a guess. That's what decades of population research keeps finding. And here's what doesn't add up. You'd think that as testosterone naturally drops with age, prostate growth would slow down too, not speed up. But for a lot of men, it does the opposite. I'm 83. My prostate used to feel like a fist pressing low in my belly by 4 in the afternoon, every single day, like clockwork. In the next few minutes, I'll walk you through the one habit that actually eased that pressure, and it had almost nothing to do with what I expected. These days, I sit through a full afternoon of cards with my neighbors without shifting in my chair every 10 minutes, without that low ache creeping in right around 3 o'clock. I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying it because I spent years assuming that pressure was just something you accepted after 80, and I was wrong about that. The swelling didn't come on suddenly. It crept in over years, a heaviness low in my belly after lunch, a dull ache that got worse the longer I sat, a feeling like something down there was simply taking up more room than it used to. I chalked it up to age, the way most men do. Getting old, I figured, meant your body just started pressing on itself in uncomfortable places, and there wasn't much to be done about that except live with it. My routine had quietly narrowed around that discomfort without me even noticing it happening. I stopped taking the long way to the mailbox because it meant passing the downstairs bathroom twice instead of once. I turned down a fishing trip with my son-in-law because I wasn't sure I could sit in a boat for 3 hours without that pressure building into something I couldn't ignore. I told him I just wasn't up for it that week. That wasn't true. I was up for the fishing. I just wasn't up for explaining why I needed to stop the truck twice on a 40-minute drive. I never once brought it up at a regular checkup, not directly. I'd mention it sideways, the way men my age tend to do, still dealing with the usual prostate business, and take whatever general nod I got back as permission to keep quietly managing it alone. Part of me assumed there was nothing more specific to ask. If it's just age, what exactly is there to discuss? What actually happened, though, is that I sat down with a doctor friend of mine, a retired urologist I've known for going on 30 years, and I finally asked him the question I'd been avoiding for a long time. Why does this keep getting worse when I'm not exactly living wild anymore? I expected him to say it was simply testosterone declining, the story I'd always been told. Instead, he told me something that stopped me cold, that a hormone most men never think twice about, insulin, plays a much bigger role in prostate growth than testosterone does for a lot of men my age. Here's the part that doesn't add up if you only think about testosterone. Testosterone falls with age. If that were the whole story, prostate growth should slow down as we get older, not speed up. But research has documented that chronically elevated insulin, the kind that builds up quietly from years of processed food, irregular eating, and a body that stopped handling sugar the way it used to, behaves almost like a growth signal to prostate tissue, independent of what testosterone is doing at all. It nudges cells toward growing, the same way it nudges fat storage and other tissue growth throughout the body. That reframed everything for me. I'd been blaming a hormone that was actually declining, when the real driver was a separate system entirely, one tied to how and when I ate, not to some unstoppable clock I had no control over. He explained it to me in plainer terms than I expected from a man who spent decades in surgical scrubs. Think of insulin, he said, as a foreman on a construction site. Most of the time, it's telling cells to store energy, do routine maintenance, nothing dramatic. But when it's shouting instructions around the clock, day after day, because the body never gets a real break from processing food, some tissues start treating that constant noise as a signal to expand, to build more of themselves. Prostate tissue, it turns out, listens to that particular foreman more than most people realize. He also told me something I hadn't considered, that this is exactly why so many men my age get frustrated when the standard advice doesn't seem to touch their discomfort. They cut back on saturated fat, maybe lose a little weight, and the pressure barely budges, because nobody ever pointed them toward the actual lever. It isn't about weight alone. It's about how often and how intensely that insulin signal fires throughout the day and night. I sat with that for a long while after he said it. decades of vaguely blaming just getting older, and the real culprit had been sitting in plain sight the whole time, tied to something as ordinary as when I ate breakfast and how many times a day I reached for a snack out of boredom rather than hunger. For years, one number ran my life, the PSA. It would tick up a point and I'd lie awake the whole night, certain it meant the worst, picturing the biopsy, the knife, the end of everything. Then someone finally told me the truth no doctor had. That number doesn't measure cancer, it measures your prostate. And as we age, it climbs mostly because the gland is simply enlarging, benign, swollen, and uncomfortable, not the worst. The number was scaring me half to death over something ordinary. And the prescriptions they push to shrink it? They can flatten your drive completely, soften everything, quietly take the man right out of you. I wasn't willing to trade that away. There's a gentle way to support that gland, keep it comfortable, a healthy size, without surrendering any of that. Keep getting checked every year, of course. At 83, that number doesn't own me anymore. I finally have peace. Let me show you what gave it to me in this video. And if you want the simple support I personally use, there's a free presentation linked in the description below. So here's the one habit I actually built once I understood what was driving the swelling. I stopped grazing on food throughout the day and gave my body real gaps between meals. A light, genuine fast of 12 to 14 hours overnight. Nothing dramatic, just letting my system rest instead of constantly processing something. And after my 2 main meals, instead of sitting straight down in my recliner the way I used to, I took a walk. 15 minutes, no more, right after eating, before the food had a chance to just sit there, spiking my blood sugar while I sat still. The mechanism made sense once it was explained to me plainly. A short walk after eating helps the body clear glucose from the bloodstream more efficiently, which means less of that growth-signaling insulin response lingering afterward. And giving my body a real stretch of hours without food each night let my baseline insulin settle down instead of staying elevated around the clock. I built a small system around it, not just one habit standing alone. Less processed food generally, fewer packaged snacks, less white bread, less of the sugary stuff I used to keep in the pantry for the grandkids and ended up eating myself. A walk after both lunch and dinner, rain or shine, treated as non-negotiable. And that overnight window without eating, which meant no more raiding the fridge at 10 at night out of habit rather than actual hunger. None of these pieces would have meant much on their own. It was the combination, held steady for a couple of months, that actually changed how my afternoons felt. I won't pretend the first 2 weeks were easy. Breaking a habit of grabbing something out of the pantry at 10 at night just because the television was on and my hands wanted something to do was harder than I expected from a man who thought he had reasonable self-control. My wife noticed before I said anything. She found me standing in front of the open refrigerator one night out of pure habit, staring at nothing in particular, and just quietly closed it for me and steered me back to the living room. We laughed about it later, but at the time it felt like breaking a routine 30 years deep. The walks were easier to stick with, mostly because they gave me something to actually do with the restlessness I used to feel after a big meal, instead of just sitting there with it. 15 minutes down the block and back, past the Henderson's garden, past the corner where the school bus used to stop when my kids were young. It became less of a chore and more of a small pocket of the day I actually looked forward to. By the 3rd week, I noticed the afternoon ache showing up later than it used to, not gone, but pushed back an hour or 2. By the 6th week, some days it didn't show up at all. I kept a little notebook, nothing formal, just a line or 2 most evenings, mostly so I wouldn't talk myself into believing improvement that wasn't really there. Looking back through those pages was what finally convinced me this wasn't wishful thinking. Last week I stood through an entire outdoor concert with my daughter, 2 hours on my feet, without once needing to find a bench and sit because of that old pressure. She noticed before I said a word about it. I think about a man named Emmett who wrote to me after seeing an earlier video, 79, retired from 30 years driving a delivery route, who told me his afternoons had turned into an endless search for the nearest bathroom and the nearest place to sit. He'd assumed, like I had, that it was simply the cost of getting old. When he heard about the insulin connection, he told me it was the first explanation that actually made sense to him, because he could point to exactly when his eating habits had gotten looser, right around when his wife passed and he stopped cooking real meals for one person. Emmett started with just the after-dinner walk, he said, because the fasting piece felt like too much change all at once. Within a few weeks, he added the overnight gap, too, once the walk alone showed him it was worth the effort. He told me the change wasn't overnight and dramatic. It was gradual, the pressure easing a little more each week, until one day he realized he'd gone an entire afternoon without thinking about his prostate at all. He also told me about the moment it really landed for him, sitting at his granddaughter's dance recital, 90 minutes on a folding chair, something he'd have dreaded and cut short a year earlier. He said he caught himself halfway through actually watching the recital instead of doing math in his head about how long until intermission and the nearest exit. That's the part he wanted me to pass along, more than any of the technical details, that the goal was never really about a symptom easing up on a chart somewhere. It was about getting to just sit and watch his granddaughter dance without his own body pulling his attention away from her. If you're on medication for your prostate, your blood pressure, or your blood sugar, please hear this clearly. Nothing here replaces your treatment or your regular checkups, and you should never stop or adjust a medication without your doctor. Keep seeing your doctor for your regular prostate checks, without exception. Understanding this connection doesn't replace that. It just gives you something real to do between visits. What I want you to walk away with is this. The swelling you're feeling might not be a simple, unstoppable consequence of getting older. For a real number of men, it's tangled up with something as ordinary and correctable as how your body is handling sugar day to day. That's not me telling you to panic about your blood sugar. It's me telling you there's an actual lever here, one within your reach. Here's what I settled on, a few drops a day. And let me tell you why it works. One compound calms one signal, but a swollen prostate answers when several are calmed at once. The growth signal, the inflammation, the pressure inside it. So what I use concentrates them, working as one, the way the research actually uses them, not a single ingredient pretending to be enough. A gland that stays comfortable and a healthy size, fewer trips, and the quiet of no longer fearing that number. It leaves the man fully intact, none of that flattening the prescriptions can do. It's linked right under this video, go look for yourself. It won't replace your doctor or your yearly check. It supports the biology right alongside them. I'm 83, and that number doesn't own me anymore. I think about the man I was, shifting in his chair every afternoon, quietly assuming that discomfort was just the price of 80. And I think about the man I am now, who takes a walk after dinner because it genuinely eases something real, not out of some abstract sense that exercise is good for you. That's the difference, not a miracle, just finally understanding what my own body was actually asking for. If you've ever assumed a discomfort like this was simply unavoidable with age, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one myself. And if this kind of plain, honest explanation is useful to you, go ahead and subscribe. There's more of this coming every week.